tomorrow evening and overnight. And in fact, the cloud will tend to thicken once again. So again, it won't be an especially cold night. No frost on the cards, temperatures holding up into high single figures for most. So that brings us to the start of the weekend. Sunshine and showers to start the day. Again, the showers will be heavy at times, particularly across the northern half of the country. They will, though, tend to fade away from the south as the day wears on, ahead of the next weather system, which pushes in from the southwest later in the day. And that will bring a very wet and windy day for most of us on Sunday, but turning quieter on Monday.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
GB News on your television and on your radio. On tonight's Mark Steyn show, it's global apocalypse. Time stand well back. Oil, gas, nukes, bioterror weapons with a 60% fatality rate. Armageddon out of here. But every mushroom cloud has a silver lining. That is you, the non-apocalyptic part of the show. Let me know what's on your mind by email. gbviews@gbnews.uk. You can Twitter me at gbnews. We have Stump the Steyn coming up. Ask me anything about anything. And feel free to throw in a few ad hominem bunker busters if you wish. All that after the news with Miranda Shunker.
Hello, the top stories from the GB newsroom. Officials in the Ukrainian city of Mariupol says it's impossible for civilians to leave as Russia continues with its bombardment. This video has been released by the Ukrainian military, who claim it shows the aftermath of an assault on a residential area in the city. 400,000 people have now been without power or water for more than a week, and several attempts to set up a humanitarian corridor have failed. Yesterday, an airstrike on a maternity hospital in the city left 3 people dead, including a child, and at least 17 wounded. A spokesperson for the Ukrainian president says Russia has changed its tactics and is now targeting civilians. Well, as Ukrainians continue to flee the country, a group of 20 children suffering with chronic illnesses and cancer, along with 50 family members, have crossed into Poland. Paramedics carried them into a hospital carriage of a train equipped with stretchers and medical supplies heading to the border. Just a few of the 1.4 million people to have entered Poland from Ukraine since the invasion began. Well, the Home Secretary says Ukrainian refugees with passports can now apply online to come to the UK. It means application centres in Europe can focus on helping those who don't have passports. Priti Patel told the Commons she's streamlining the approach, while Boris Johnson says the numbers of Ukrainians coming to the UK will continue to climb steeply.
I think it's also important that we have checks, and I think people do understand that when you've got large numbers of people leaving from a war zone, some of them are still armed, perhaps not all of their identities completely clear, their motivations completely clear, it is responsible also to have checks.
The French president says it's unrealistic to engage in negotiations for Ukraine to join the EU whilst the country is at war. Emmanuel Macron made the comments as France hosts a two-day summit for European leaders to discuss Russia's invasion. Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte shared the French president's view, saying there's no fast-track procedure for EU membership. And Sports Minister Nadine Dorries says Roman Abramovich must not benefit if Chelsea Football Club is sold. The Russian billionaire was added to the UK sanctions list today. Described as a pro-Kremlin oligarch, the Chelsea owner has been hit with an asset freeze and a travel ban. The government has issued a special licence to enable Chelsea Football Club to continue to play its fixtures and fulfil its obligations for the rest of the season. Well, on TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to Mark Steyn.
Because we had one or two slight, barely perceptible technical glitches yesterday, we're going to begin today where we began last night, with the disclosure by Victoria Newland, the Deputy Assistant, Under Assistant Deputy, whatever, in the, quote, Biden, unquote, administration, that there are biolabs in Ukraine that the US government has failed to secure, despite the self-same US government warning us for weeks that Russia was about to invade Ukraine. Before we get into the swamp of detail on that, let me just tell you how things stand 2 weeks in, day 15 of this thing. There are innocents in Ukraine, undoubtedly. The pregnant women in labour, covered in blood, emerging from a shelled hospital. The dead children lying in the street. But it's harder to figure out who the good guys are. 2 years ago, I was partially suckered by the COVID. I thought that the West's silence re what China had done to the world was because our leaders were simply too cowardly, and Beijing, or Peking, as Peter Hitchens likes to reprimand me, the Peking was simply too powerful. But it's worse than that, as we now know from the disclosure of emails from early 2020 between Francis Collins, head of the US National Institutes of Health, and Anthony Fauci, head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, and other so-called public health officials. Emails that were strikingly at odds with their public statements at the time. Fauci knew from the beginning that it was likely this was one of ours, as they say. Unbeknownst to the American people, the US government was quietly using Eco-Health Alliance, headed by a British subject, Peter Daszak, as a cutout to do US-funded, in fact CIA-funded, gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which has the security protocols of the average dentist's office. The Chinese Politburo are the slickest liars on the planet, but even a stopped clock tells the truth twice a day. And Chairman Xi's odd insistence that COVID was an American thing turns out to be at least partly true. And according to the official numbers, 6 million people around the planet are dead because of it. That's tragic. That the government agencies responsible for this situation lied about it for the last 2 years very angrily in the case of Fauci testifying in Congress is evil. We're now going through the same old rigmarole with the belatedly coughed up Pfizer documents that show a 23% systemic adverse effect and that the vaccine, once it's in your arm, likes to check out the rest of the neighbourhood. Within 48 hours, 0.09% of it ends up in the ovaries, and over 16% in the liver. That's good news for Pfizer, because in a year or three we'll have a whole bunch of new ailments requiring whole new lines of medicinal products. There is a gag from a British comedy show, Mitchell and Webb, that has become world famous. The two German officers in World War II sitting around chit-chatting when the penny drops. Are we the baddies? In the case of Washington and the COVID, the answer, at least partially, is yes. Chairman Xi is bad too, but it's baddies versus baddies, like the old Henry Kissinger jokes from the Iran-Iraq war. Now we have exactly the same thing in Ukraine, a quote agreement between the US Department of Defense and the Ukrainian Ministry of Health, by which the Americans fund and the Ukrainians run biolabs. The apologists, the social media enforcers, the court eunuchs of the legacy media said just 2 weeks ago, oh no, this is just some post-Soviet cleanup. The rest of it's a conspiracy theory. When the Bolsheviks went belly up, they left a lot of dodgy facilities planted hither and yon, and we've just been helping the Ukrainians keep the lid on things. No, sorry, that's a government lie. And if you just want to keep amplifying it, you shouldn't be working in the media. You should be working as a parrot in a pet shop window. Actually, the Pentagon has been funding brand new, entirely post-Soviet biolabs in Ukraine. I've mentioned before that the earliest photos in my family album are from Odessa, a branch of the family long gone from that town. But Ukraine-wise, because of that connection, I follow Odessa with particular interest. The National Pulse, edited by Rahim Kassam, who was on this show last week, dug up this news story from BioPrep Watch in 2010. Quote, US Senator Dick Lugar applauded the opening of the Interim Central Reference Laboratory in Odessa, Ukraine this week, announcing that it will be instrumental in researching dangerous pathogens used by bioterrorists. The Level 3 Biosafety Lab, which is the first built under the expanded authority of the Non-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, will be used to study anthrax, tularemia, and Q fever, as well as other dangerous pathogens. Unquote. Unquote. You know what anthrax is? There was a big scare just after 9/11. Tularemia is listed by the US government as a biological warfare agent that in certain strains has 60% fatality rates. Q fever is ranked by the US government as a Category B bioterrorism agent. Here's its selling point. You only need a single bacillus, just the one. No bacilli, we don't need the plural, just one bacillus to achieve a 50% infection rate. That's the biggest bang for the buck of any bioterror agent on the planet. Ukraine, of course, is the poorest country in Europe, with a gross national income significantly lower than Kosovo, Moldova, Albania, or Belarus. As we've said before, it's also the most corrupt country in Europe. But apparently its global reputation for cutting-edge, state-of-the-art research into, quote, dangerous pathogens is such that US taxpayers are funding Q fever labs in Odessa, a city of 1 million people. Why would you set up such a lab in Ukraine? And why, when you've been warning for months that the Russians were about to invade, would you only now be thinking about securing such labs? And why would you disclose it to the world in the way Victoria Nuland just did in the United States Senate? This is the 15th day of this war. We've gone from biolabs, that's Russian disinformation, to biolabs, oh yeah, but it's just post-Soviet cleanup, to biolabs, but we don't own them, we just fund them via the Pentagon, to biolabs, okay, we don't just fund them, we actually got an American firm, Black & Veatch of Overland Park, Kansas, to build them, to biolabs, okay, we're a bit concerned that that new one we built for Q fever research, the one that only requires a single bacillus, might fall into Russian hands. Meanwhile, the Russians are closing in on Odessa, and both the Russians and the Americans, and now the Chinese, and even Her Britannic Majesty's government in London are warning of some kind of impending bioweapons incident in Ukraine. That's very reassuring, isn't it? Let me know your thoughts. GBviews at gbnews.uk. You can tweet me at gbnews. With me now is the investigative journalist from the National Pulse who broke this story, Natalie Winters. Natalie, why on earth would any civilized nation, such as the United States, be doing this kind of research in the most impoverished, the poorest, the most corrupt country in Europe, and in a city of 1 million people?
Well, that's really a multi-million-dollar question. And I think anyone who's watching your segment and feeling a bit of deja vu with what happened at the Wuhan Institute of Virology is totally correct. And I don't just say that because of the cover-up we've already seen from all the fact-checking organizations in the mainstream media, but also because of the pathogens that this laboratory, at least one of them, has been dealing with. Frankly, they seem to be more deadly, as you were referencing, than just any random old strain of coronavirus. So it really is curious why the United States government, particularly the Department of Defense, would be deciding to fund these laboratories, which we actually just put up a news story at the National Pulse today, documenting how these were all used to be bioweapons facilities used by the Soviet Union. And very interestingly, there were a lot of reports coming from these kind of establishment think tanks, all in Washington, D.C., that repeatedly for years warned that these laboratory facilities were doing experiments with very, very deadly pathogens with, quote, the windows wide open. That's a direct quote from one of these reports. They went into the really improper laboratory protocols and safety measures that these labs were taking, even despite receiving U.S. funds. And specifically the story we put up yesterday had to do with that it was actually our former president, Barack Obama, who really spearheaded this effort to get these labs U.S. taxpayer funds. We found a separate report that goes into really even scarier detail about the types of pathogens and really the manipulations and what exactly these researchers were doing with these labs or with these pathogens. But you are very, very right. I don't know why we would ever be funding a lab that is, not only in a country like Ukraine, but that's so proximal to Russia, when we've been hearing from, the American elites, the establishment think tanker types for years about how Russia is ready to pounce on Ukraine any second, yet there seems to be no contingency plan to get these pathogens secured and out of the hands of Russian oligarchs.
No, that's very true. And I think it's not, you don't have to be a Putin lover to think that if you were in Washington and you discovered that the Russian government was building a facility for anthrax in, say, Niagara Falls, Ontario, that Washington would be a little concerned about it. Is Washington doing this? Because most of the things a government wants to do, it generally does within the borders of its own country. But would it be illegal to actually be experimenting, doing gain-of-function research on these kind of pathogens if you wanted to do it in Cleveland or Des Moines or wherever?
Well, so that's kind of one of the narratives that we've really been experiencing amidst the investigation into the origins of COVID-19, specifically to the fact that a lot of this riskier form of research, particularly gain of function, which has to deal with making viruses more deadly, more virulent, and just lethal to humans, is often outsourced or offshored to different countries that have more lax regulations when it comes to what exactly you can do with these pathogens. And it's hard to, answer in detail, at least right now, where the story's kind of just breaking, what exactly this lab was working on in terms of the pathogens, if they were engaging in gain-of-function research. But I think the big tell, the quiet part out loud, is the fact that we've already seen such a massive cover-up campaign mounted, not just by the U.S. State Department, but by their counterparts in the mainstream media, the fact-checking organizations, to really kind of get ahead of the story. And we know all too well from the story of the Wuhan Institute of Virology that the more we dug into the type of research they were doing, not only did we find military connections, but we found researchers admitting that they were seeking to find strains of infections that were capable of direct human infection.
Yeah, that which is terrifying, and actually for which the relevant parties have not been held to account. I mean, Fauci's been off TV since the Ukraine thing got going. I think he's just, doing odd little local radio in Presque Isle, Maine or something. So he's not on the big networks anymore. But the fact is, those public health guys got away with lying about this for 2 years. And what I find odd, you talked about, the saying the quiet part out loud, whatever you want to call it. Once she said it in Congress, Marco Rubio then immediately jumped to his next question, his last question. Oh, but you're 100% clear that if anything wacky happens in Ukraine, it's all the Russians' fault, which sort of gave the impression that there's an agreed that something terrible is about to happen. So we're getting out in front of it by making it clear that anything that does happen is the Russians' fault.
Yeah, I think they're laying the groundwork for a certain narrative. And I think as anyone who watches American mainstream media knows all too well, that's their modus operandi. That's how they operate. And I think the fact that you even saw a statement coming out from the State Department very late last night on Twitter, where they said we don't have any chemical or biological warfare type laboratories existing in Ukraine. I think it was probably right after a Tucker Carlson show aired, really tells you that they're watching and that they're listening to this narrative develop. And it just makes you wonder, what exactly they have to hide, especially coming on the heels of COVID-19. And we know the massive cover-up that came not just from the mainstream media, but very, very, very calculated. And I think it's very hypocritical when you see these people accuse, outlets much like the National Pulse of spreading Russian disinformation, which is a farcical claim, at face value, because frankly, they're engaging in a similar type of disinformation campaign. It's state-sponsored propaganda in its own right when you see the U.S. State Department colluding with different media outlets to really get ahead of this narrative.
Oh, no, that's true. And that pathetic figure at the Pentagon, that, whatever he is, the 4-star admiral with the dancing eyebrows, who never actually answers the question. But here, what I don't get is the most lavishly funded military on the planet. It's the most lavishly funded anything on the planet, actually, Washington. Why didn't it just secure these facilities in the 2 to 3 months it's been telling us that Putin is going to invade?
Well, I think it goes to the heart of the issue. In the United States, they love the phrase trust the experts, and whether those experts are people like Anthony Fauci or people who sit in their cushy think tank positions in Washington, D.C., these so-called experts, their guiding ideology, their guiding principle, really, I think, is one of globalism, is one of just wanting an interconnected world. Not just do they, outsource and offshore our factories and manufacturing capabilities overseas, but they see no issue in sending U.S. taxpayer dollars overseas to fund these risky research collaborations with facilities that are not up to par in terms of their safety standards. And you really would have thought that after COVID-19, with what happened, that people would have learned their lesson. But you only see people like Anthony Fauci when you can actually see him on the media doubling down and defending international collaboration, which is really concerning, not just for the United States, but for really the biosafety of the world writ large.
Oh, yeah, that's a great phrase. The biosafety of the world. These experts are going to completely screw the biosafety of the world at large, Natalie. Buy your next beach house on planet Zongo. That's my advice. Okay, we're going to get to... thank you very much for that, Natalie. We appreciate it. We're going to get to your reaction next. And what if it does go pear-shaped? Or as this is Russian, bear-shaped? All straight ahead on GB News, Britain's news channel. We're coming right back.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Coming up on Dan Wootton Tonight, as Ukrainians continue their brave resistance, we'll once again cross live to insiders on the ground. The country's Deputy Digital Minister, Alex Bornyakov, gives me fascinating insight into the groundbreaking digital warfare he's leading against Russian forces. Plus, the Georgian war veteran Mamukha Mamulashvili, who's preparing for his 5th battle against the Russians, joins me to deliver a deadly warning to Putin. Elsewhere, how did it feel to be one of the few still on planet normal during the pandemic? Well, GB News star Liam Halligan and his podcast co-host Alison Pearson have faced vicious backlash for delivering a regular dose of COVID common sense. They'll be next to give evidence in my lockdown inquiry. And I'll break down the day's biggest stories with my superstar panel. The Daily Mail columnist Sarah Vine, political commentator and writer Dominique Samuels, and broadcaster and author Amy Nicol. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News.
Okay, let's get to your reaction. Christopher says, for anyone who has studied Putin's strategies in Georgia, South Ossetia, Crimea, Syria, and indeed the United Kingdom, it's a tactic so that he can use chemical weapons in Ukraine and claim it wasn't him. That's true, Christopher. On the other hand, the only reason he can do that is because there are American biolabs in Ukraine. But you're right to mention that he's not shy about using polonium and Novichok on the streets of England. The heady who doesn't like the heady perfume of polonium from the corsage of the St. Petersburg honey trap sitting on the next stool at the bar in Mayfair. Alina says this is just one lab on foreign soil. We could be looking at Wuhan 2.0 on American soil. Who knows how many labs are here in the States, says Alina from America. No, it's not just one lab on foreign soil. There are an admitted 13 American labs in Ukraine, and the Russians, I mean, they're all lying to us now. We are in a blizzard of lies, and I expect a an ex-KGB strongman to lie to me. It's a little different when supposedly democratic governments of citizen representatives accountable to their own people lie to their own people, as Washington has been doing. But the Americans admit to 13 such biolabs in Ukraine, as well as others throughout the former Soviet empire. The Russians say there are in fact 30 such biolabs. Helen says the idea that Putin wouldn't take advantage of such weaponry already on a battlefield belongs in unicorn sock puppet land. Yeah, but the point about this is that at some point, you know, America is dying. America's 1950 post-war imperium is over. And it's embodied by the two people who supposedly are the most senior Americans in America. The dead husk of a moth-eaten sock puppet who whoever's waggling him, is passing off as the President of the United States. And then the nitwit Vice President, who is going to be taken over at some point when the sock puppet decides he'd rather stay in his basement and eat tapioca all day long. And then it's Kamala, who's just made a fool of herself in Poland, representing the United States. Bob says, what happened to Wuhan 1.0? Is China still denying? No, the issue here is that America's still denying. As I said, we expect dictators, and the reason we have democracies is so they're accountable to us. You know, if you have a czar, as they do effectively in Russia, if you have a communist strongman like Chairman Xi, you expect those guys to lie. As I said, when you have citizen representatives, the whole reason they threw off George III in that revolution they were always going on about is that so they could be self-governing. And yet there were these people who are not accountable and who don't tell the American people what they're doing. The American people just have to pay. They fund. They're having to pay all this petrol prices they've never paid before in their lives. And at the same time, they also have to somehow come up with the money to fund hundreds of millions of dollars to fund all these biolabs in Ukraine. For what purpose? We know not. Okay, early on in this war, Russia seized from Ukraine. This is a word we always love to see back in the news. Russia seized from Ukraine the well-known nuclear plant, most famous nuclear plant in the world, at Chernobyl. What was Barack Obama's line again in that debate with Mitt Romney? The 1980s called, and they want their foreign policy back. Well, the 1980s are back. Chernobyl. The Russians took it over and they've managed to unplug it, which apparently you're not meant to do to an unsafe nuclear facility such as Chernobyl. So we've got leaking radiation there. This is going to be a very consequential day if they don't succeed in the next few hours in putting the plug back in and reconnecting Chernobyl to the electric grid. And Russia has also put its nukes on alert, because if we've learned anything this last fortnight, it's that their conventional forces are not all they should be. So could this thing go nuclear? Well, Harry Kazianis of the Center for the National Interest is paid to think about such things. As a matter of fact, about 2 years ago, he took part gaming out such a scenario, a war between NATO and Russia over Ukraine. You'll love this sentence. It's from his very first paragraph. This is fantastic. In the course of what we called the NATO-Russia war of 2019, we estimated 1 billion people died. 1 billion. Wow. That makes Omicron look like a mild cold. Harry Kazianis joins me now. You do this a lot, Harry, gaming out particular scenario. They do it at the Pentagon. They do it in other countries, in their ministries of defense too, gaming out how particular scenarios are likely to go. And when you gamed out Russia and NATO over Ukraine, you foresaw particular tripwires that could let it go nuclear.
Absolutely, Mark. Thanks for having me on. I'm a huge fan. The challenge here, Mark, is that every time I've done these war games, I've done them for about 5 or 6 years now, maybe a little longer, depending on the situation. What always happens is anytime NATO and Russia get into kinetic conflict, in other words, once the bombs start dropping, it always goes to nuclear war. The reason why that happens and how the war actually starts, most of the time, I'll be honest with you, Mark, it's usually a mistake. I mean, you know, irregardless of the spin coming out of Moscow or Washington or wherever, nobody wants to see a war between NATO and Russia. That's crazy. That's suicidal. But what always ends up happening in these scenarios is a mistake that happens where nobody can back off. In a lot of the scenarios I've done, give you a quick example, usually an errant missile lands in NATO territory. In one example, we had an errant missile landed in Poland and destroyed a school. Well, the Poles wanted to respond. And that sets up a chain of events where Article 5 is declared, NATO and Russia start fighting. Russia has no way to beat NATO in any sort of conventional means whatsoever. And you don't have to have a PhD from Princeton to figure it out. It's just compare the numbers. Russia loses. It's over. So every time you have this scenario where NATO and Russia start fighting, what ends up happening is Russia starts using tactical nuclear weapons. In other words, battlefield nuclear weapons, smaller weapons, a little bit smaller than Hiroshima, let's say. And what happens is the United States responds with its own tactical nuclear weapons. Russia starts nuking cities. We start nuking cities. There's 1 billion people.
So you in fact gamed out what has happened really in the last fortnight in Ukraine, in that conventional forces underperform. And at a certain level, the Russian high command knows that. So they know, and that's up against the Ukrainian military. So they know if they're up against the Polish and moving west, other serious armed forces, including the Americans, then they know they're going to lose that. So their incentive is to go nuclear sooner rather than later.
Exactly. And in any sort of scenario like that, the Russians lose. I mean, we've gamed it out. We did one scenario, Mark, I've actually talked about this before. We took the Russians' nuclear weapons away just to see if what could happen. Is there any sort of sinister strategy that Vladimir Putin and his generals could sort of utilize to win a war against NATO? There's none. NATO forces march all the way to Moscow. It's over. Putin's deposed. So the Russians have to use nuclear weapons. And they've told us this, Mark. This is the crazy thing that I don't understand why people aren't looking into. You Google this and find it out in 2 minutes. The Russians have a military doctrine called escalate to de-escalate. In other words, they know they'll lose a war against NATO. So what do? They have told us that any time that their homeland is threatened in any way, shape, or form, they will use nuclear weapons at their discretion. What's scary about this, Mark, is they're already starting to signal that maybe it doesn't have to be an invasion. Maybe it doesn't have to be a bomb dropped on, Moscow or St. Petersburg or something like that. We are doing tremendous damage to their economy. I mean, depending on how you look at the estimates, we've already done about $1 trillion in damage to Russia's economy. If you combine the foreign exchange reserves, they can't deploy anymore to save the ruble, and the amount of damage that their economy has already been incurred because it's not going to grow at all. In fact, it's going to lose 35% of its value this year. That's $1 trillion right there, my friend. At what point does Vlad start to say, well, I've already lost everything. It's, maybe it's time to just go all in. That's what really terrifies me. I have to be honest.
Well, that's the salient feature of these first few weeks of this war, is that we seem to have gone straight from August 1914 and the assassination of the Archduke to reducing the Kaiser's empire to the bankrupt Weimar Republic. And I don't quite get what the strategic value of that is, because if we're saying, well, we're not going to go to war with you, but we're just going to destroy your country in another way, that, as you said, is all the incentive he needs to escalate.
That's the whole thing, Mark. I mean, look, I'm going to be honest. I hate Vladimir Putin. I think everybody in the West collectively hates this man. I mean, what he is doing in Ukraine is he is weaponizing genocide and using that now as his tactic in bombing those cities to smithereens, whether it's in Kiev, next Odessa, Mariupol. Everybody knows that. And I think we all collectively agree that's a tragedy. But the challenge now is what nobody wants to say is the only solution the West has right now is that regime change is really what everybody wants and is on the table. I mean, how else does this end if we're basically going to destroy Russia's economy, make sure that people are impoverished. I mean, we're going to see breadlines again like the Soviet Union. I mean, MasterCard and Visa have pulled out. I mean, the only lifeline that Russia has at this point is they're going to have to be a vassal state of China. They're going to end up being a giant-sized version of North Korea at this point. So we really need to think about de-escalation. I know that's not popular. I know I'm going to be called a stooge of Vladimir Putin, but I don't want to see a third world war either. I would like a day where the flowers bloom and the world continues on. And at the path we're going, as you kind of indicated, there's no off ramp. There's no buffer here. The buffer is disappearing very, very quickly. And the Russians are eventually going to get to a point where they're going to get desperate, where Vladimir Putin is going to think, well, I'm doomed. I have nowhere else to go. I might as well go all in with every weapon I have to try and get the West to stop. And we're getting to that point where we're running out of time. So I think we need to start thinking about de-escalation. And just a quick point, Mark, I would make, we need to think about how many weapons we're sending into Ukraine. Quick example, we've sent 17,000 anti-tank weapons into Ukraine, or are going to be into Ukraine. The Russians only have 12,000 tanks total. That's a lot of weapons to send into Ukraine. Again, we all hate Putin, but I think we need to think about the scale of what we're throwing in here. It's immense.
Yep. That's a very interesting point. Right now, as far as I'm aware, the only Western leader who's even still speaking to Putin is Monsieur Macron in Paris, who's, I think, has spoken to him a dozen times in the last couple of weeks. And he thinks that that Putin is digging himself in deeper. I mean, as the expression you use, off-ramp, you know, we're fighting this a bit like a comic book thing. Yes, it's much more exciting to say, like Lindsey Graham did, Senator Graham, why doesn't someone just take him out in the Kremlin? It's much more exciting to be like that foreign affairs panjandrum in the European Union who leaked the cunning scheme to get all the Polish planes into Ukraine and repaint them and give them to Ukrainian pilots, which might be a good idea, but not if you put it on the front pages of the newspapers. So we're basically saying, we don't want any off ramps. We don't want any exit ramps. We just like this expressway we're on, and we're happy to entertain even more apocalyptic scenarios as we go down the highway.
Mark, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's so many bad ideas being thrown around. I mean, we're approaching this as if we're playing PlayStation 5 and it's a video game. Let me tell you, it's not a video game. Just a couple of things. You were talking about the MiG fighters that would be brought from Poland, then sent to a U.S. air base, and then brought to Ukraine. Well, I've talked to quite a few people who were actually involved in some of those negotiations. They're not exactly, some very senior Pentagon officials, and I'll tell you, Mark, they're not thrilled about the idea. First of all, just because it's a MiG-29 does not necessarily mean it is the exact same MiG-29 that a Ukrainian pilot needs to fly. First of all, the controls will be in Polish. The computer systems will be in Polish. That is not exactly easy to convert over. You can't convert that over in hours or days. That takes time. Then you had to take those MiG-29s and integrate them in the command and control structure of the Ukrainian military. Again, that takes time. The other thing that the media is not talking about is a lot of these MiG-29 fighters were completely gutted and changed over to much more modern, sophisticated avionics and technology. The Poles have to rip all of that out. I don't know if they've done that or just going to leave them in place. The Ukrainian pilots just can't jump into the plane and say, let's go take on the Russians. That's a death sentence. I mean, they're approaching this as if, you know, you're handing me the keys to your car and expect me to drive it. Most situations I can, but if the controls are in Polish and I don't know where any of the buttons are, it's a huge problem. And then expecting those pilots to go to war. One last point, no-fly zones that everybody's talking about, Mark. No-fly zones are a tantamount to declaring World War III in Ukraine. In order to enforce a no-fly zone, you would have to destroy all of the Russians' command and control architecture in that area, all their air defense networks, to create a safe environment for our pilots. That's World War III. So again, this is not a video game. This is real life, and we need to approach it that way.
Yes, and I find it interesting that when you gamed out a very responsible scenario 2 years ago, And Ukraine borders a lot of countries. You know, it borders Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Moldova. A lot of accidents can happen when you're trying to hit towns near those borders. But the new wrinkle in the last few weeks is that we seem to have absolutely a bonkers leadership class that, as you say, is treating this like some kind of computer game, and they just want to get on to the more exciting rounds of the game, which is most bizarre. Thank you very much for joining us, Harry. And as you say, if it does go nuclear, huge numbers of people. You stack up the first million and the tens of millions and all the rest of it very, very quickly. So let's hope we don't get there. Great to see you, Harry. We appreciate you coming on the show. Coming up, ask me anything you'd like. It's Stump the Steyn time, GBViews at gbnews.uk. You can Twitter me at GBnews. And do not touch that dial, because we're swinging right back with Thane Gustafsson after nukes and bioterror agents. We're in the relatively sane realm of oil and gas. Stick around.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate.
From all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel.
Right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Okay, if we can avoid the bioterror and nukes, we may still be in dire straits, broke and shivering. After depending on them as a matter of routine for years, every civilized person now reviles Russian oil and gas, and like drug addicts, heroin addicts, fentanyl addicts, pledges to give them up, but not quite yet. The United Kingdom says it will be off Russian oil by the end of the year. The EU is saying it will cease to depend on Russian energy by the end of 2030. Thane Gustafsson from Georgetown University has stayed on top of this situation as it's metastasized over the decades. His most recent book is The Bridge: Natural Gas in a Redivided Europe. And Thane, your chapter on Ukraine is fascinating to me, because I had no idea about this, that in fact, in the Soviet Union, Ukraine was the big supplier of gas. It was the original gas state in the Soviet Union. And in fact, the only reason we're now talking about Russian gas is because the Ukrainian gas eventually got tapped out. But that's why, for example, all those gas lines run through Ukraine, because Ukraine was gas central in the old Soviet days.
That's absolutely right. The central planners used the Ukrainian gas first, which made a lot of sense. Then they discovered gas and oil in the northern part of West Siberia, which is where most of their oil and gas comes from today. But you're absolutely right. In the meantime, they built those pipelines. And so when the Soviet Union broke up, the Russians were left with the gas, but the Ukrainians were left with the pipes. So they've been fighting over the rents from gas exports ever since. It's been a 30-year bad marriage, and now it's a messy divorce.
Well, there are other parties in this marriage, notably Germany. And we talk a lot about the impact and Germany's backed off that a bit in the last couple of days. It's in less of a hurry to back off Russian gas. But if, say, they go ahead with this cutting off Russian oil, if the West, if North America and Europe go ahead with cutting off Russian oil and gas, I heard today somebody worrying that this would actually destabilize all kinds of other parts of the planet, because in parts of Africa where suddenly the cost of filling up your car triples, there's going to be a lot more instability all over the planet. What do you think will happen as the main consequence of what the Americans and the Europeans are now proposing to do?
The United States, we take 1% of our from Russia. That's mostly oil that's used in our refineries. So that's an inconvenience, but it's certainly not life-threatening. It's really the total supply of oil to the world. And that's very much under the control these days, not just of OPEC, which used to have just 13 members, Saudi Arabia and so on, but Russia has joined in the last few years. And so there are now 13 plus 10. And that includes now Russia and Kazakhstan and some others. The 23 together have vowed that they're going to refrain from increasing oil production. They want to keep that oil price up. But now you might say they've gotten perhaps a little bit too much of a good thing with oil prices where they are right now. They've vowed to increase their oil exports by 400,000 barrels a day every month. But there are some signs that they don't have the capacity quite to follow through on that. So yes, it's tight. And if you add to that a portion of Russian oil exports, why the upward pressures on price are going to be even greater.
What difference does it make when prominent Western companies such as Shell and British Petroleum, when they pull out of Russia, as they've done in recent days? Is that just gesture politics? Is that just virtue signaling, or are there consequences to isolating Russia's oil business and its gas business from any foreign influence whatsoever?
There is the thing to watch when you're looking at the near-term impact on Russian oil production upstream is not the brand name majors, but the oil service companies such as Halliburton and Baker Hughes and so on. They are the ones who have been helping the Russians keep conventional oil production going with fracturing and long-reach oil wells. They have the most advanced fracking technology and horizontal drilling technology. So they've kept their heads down, but now they too are going to have to sell their Russian subsidiaries and move out of Russia because of the wave of sanctions against Russia. That will not impact conventional Russian oil production in the near term, however. They can keep going on their own momentum. They've learned how to use fracking and long-reach horizontal wells, enough to keep going in West Siberia. The consequences of the big majors leaving are going to be minor in the near term, except for one company, that's Total, the French company, which has invested heavily in LNG development with a Russian startup, a private sector startup, Novatek, and it's the news that we're hearing is that the French are reluctant to give up their partnership. That has been a very intense partnership. The CEO of Total, Christophe de Margerie, died on a Moscow airport in an aircraft crash on the tarmac. True. And they have been very close partners. So Total and Novatek may keep going, we'll see. But BP and Shell withdrawing, that'll have very little impact in the near term.
Why do you think that this is something that the Western powers have announced they're doing, even if they're doing it, over the course of a year or the rest of the decade, when we're dealing with a situation in which, according to the Ukrainian president, it's a matter of weeks, if not days and hours? In other words, why would you take action that is not likely to impact anyone in Russia until 2030, as the EU is planning?
Well, that's a very good question. Of course, your previous speaker, I think, quite rightly pointed out that there is no off-ramp, so the situation is highly unstable and quite dangerous. It could indeed escalate. And the man who is driving this, there is no sign of opposition to him, and there is no sign that he is really taking on board the remarkable fact that the Russian military has simply been as effective as advertised. There is one off-ramp to do, to blame the guy who's in charge of the military. Shoigu, who used to be his civil defense minister, is, you might say, very much an amateur in the position of defense minister. Why he could be perhaps a scapegoat.
Let me before we run out of time, Thane, I want to ask you this though. Gerhard Schröder, the former German chancellor, very close to the Russians. He basically makes his living now as a businessman advancing Russian interests in the West. And he's sort of appointed himself a kind of mediator between Putin and the Western leadership. He's playing the role we normally associate with Jesse Jackson or whatever. Now, does that tell you, the fact that he's basically an oil and gas guy and a Russian oil and gas guy, does that tell you that this is the most important aspect of the situation to the Russians?
Well, yes, it's not the most important aspect. We're down to military action here. We're in a world from what we've been through in the last 30 years. This is a different world from the one that Gerhard Schröder signed on. He's in a very uncomfortable him.
Yeah, that's true.
What we're seeing
you're breaking up slightly. The line's breaking up, Thane. We're going to have to leave it there. But thank you very much for joining us. And as I said, I learned so much from the Ukrainian chapter in Thane Gustafsson's book, The Bridge. Let's get to a couple of your questions before we close it out tonight. Robert says, why do you say British subjects instead of British citizens? I do, don't I? I generally take Eamon de Valera's line, as he put it, I think about almost exactly a century ago, during the ongoing negotiations with London over the creation of the Irish Free State. And dear old de Valera at one point was trying to explain to his fellow Irish nationalists who wanted there to be a separate Irish citizenship that the concept of citizenship doesn't really exist in the British Empire. And I agree with him like that. I think that I liked it with that. I think there was no difference between a British subject in Kingston-on-Thames, in Kingston, Ontario, or Kingston, Jamaica. So I like the term British subject, even though we're now, what are we meant to say, Commonwealth citizen? I don't know. Anyway, that's the phrase I like, and I'm sticking with it. Mike, can you explain the Biden family's connection to Ukraine? Yes, they're getting tons of money from Ukraine. Hunter Biden was getting near $100,000 a month for a non-job. He was also, I take it, given his tastes, getting all the Ukrainian hookers he could handle, and he can handle quite a lot. In fact, he uses them as his confessional. If you want to know what's really going on, pay no attention to governments. Find a hooker that Hunter Biden has recently been consorting with. She'll know everything. That is it from us. Dan Wootton's here for a great big thumping Thursday for 2 hours. Don't miss it. Stay safe, stay free.
Hello, I'm Helen Roberts. The next few days are looking fairly cloudy for most of us. Quite breezy, but it will be on the mild side for the time of year, and that cloud thick enough to produce some outbreaks of rain at times. Now, at the moment, we have this area of high pressure dominating across the continent, but what is also